no fossil record, and it got very developed, and then it came back over here and boom! Like, oh, well, why not fossils then over there? So it's crazy. And you know, going back to the origin, you know, not only is the Miller experiment and that the you know, they called it at one point the prebiotic or pre-something soup, right? It was this kind of all this stuff of molecules and organic compounds floating together. Well, not only did that never exist on Earth, but in fact, evolutionists, as they have looked at the Earth, they've come to the conclusion that there was never on Earth the proper environment for life to have developed. Do you know that that is the current belief? That there was never on Earth the proper environment for Earth to develop. So do you know what then the next assumption is? Okay. Well, yes. It didn't come from Earth then. I mean, I kid you not. I was at when I was going to UC Berkeley, I was shocked by the conference on the origins of life that they were actually suggesting that life could have been brought here by aliens. And I was like, wow, this is like a scientific group and they're actually proposing that. I mean, to me that is such a stretch because, okay, what evidence is there for that again? I mean, it's just like totally grasping at straws. It's just, there is no basis of fact, no evidence for it. And so they've said, well, maybe it came like on a meteorite and crashed in. And, you know, who knows where it developed? We don't have any idea. But the universe is so big that somewhere out there, there must be a condition that would be right. And so then somehow it got lodged into a meteor and came crashing down onto Earth. And of course the problem with that is what happens to meteors when they crash into Earth? Well, they burn up. You know, big burning, flaming, and that doesn't really suit itself really good to life. You know, for the most cases. Well, maybe it was buried way inside of a rock and was protected. It's like, well, yeah, but then how did it get out? It's still buried inside of that rock. So it's just, it's sometimes silly to me. I think it's kind of weird. So there is no evidence in the fossil record. In fact, they've gotten to the point of knowing and declaring that on Earth there was never the physical conditions were never right for life to have been created. Now, but then they'll say, but there's still evidence for evolution because we see, and so they'll, you know, show, see when you have the fruit flies and we can mutate them or watch them and then they'll grow 4 sets of wings. It's like, fine, I have no problem with that at all. And we've seen that to be the case. So that's what Darwin based his original thing on, was watching what we would call microevolution, which is interspecies changes. So, for instance, dogs. Dogs probably all came from one starting breed, but look at all the dogs that there are today. Now it's important to notice how most of all those dogs came about. It wasn't actually by random selection, but it was by people breeding them to form other types of dogs. Although there were, you know, they talk about the moths, right? There's the moths who were gray, and then the trees turned color over years, and so they change to be the same color as the tree. And that's fine. I am in perfect agreement. In fact, nobody has a problem with what we would call microevolution. But there is no evidence for macroevolution, which is the change from one species to be another. You know, I mean, you have that basic problem, like you would think, well, let's mate a cat and a dog and get some breed in between, right? But it doesn't work. You can't breed a cat and a dog. They can't have offspring. So there's no evidence, there's no way, there's no known mechanism for it. And evolutionists, any biologist will tell you, they will declare, yes, we know that there is no known mechanism. We don't know how it happened, but somehow, because the alternative, they're not willing to accept. So the idea that this was done by a creator, or most recently the concepts of intelligent design. And I'll talk about that in a minute here. So anyhow, macroevolution, no evidence for it at all. And so then another example was this thing of Haeckel's embryos. So what he did was, since Darwin's concept was that in early, if everything came from the same, you know, form, it would kind of make sense that there'd be a lot of similarities, you know. And so Darwin's thesis was that early embryonic development, in the early embryos, they would look and be very similar because they kind of came from the same. Well, so this guy Haeckel, he gathered some embryos and made little, they were images. I don't know if they didn't have cameras back then, but he didn't take photos. So he kind of drew some drawings, and one a fish, a salamander, tortoise, chicken, hog, calf, rabbit, and human. So he was trying to grab it from, you know, all different kinds of species and phyla. So so there were two main problems with this. First of all, the images were faked. And in fact, if you go back and look at them, people notice, it's like, whoa, these last three are exactly identical. He used the same stamp to do all of them. There was no variation, and there should have been some. The second problem is that actually he also selected ones very carefully. So for instance, he selected the salamander to represent reptiles, whereas the salamander has at some point some similarities, but the frog, for instance, never does. It's always totally different. So he selected ones that he wished, but then also what's kind of interesting is that in the differentiation of the embryos as they develop, they describe it as kind of like an hourglass. So actually at the very beginning, they're hugely different. And there's a time in which there's similarities and then it diverges. So what Haeckel did was he chose from this like fourth or fifth term of development that's most similar. He chose the ones that were most similar, and even then they were too varied for what he liked, so he just copied the image and pasted it. Oh, he actually stamped it because he didn't have cut and paste. So, and when that came out, it was, you know, huge, you know, uproar, and people were all upset. But the fact is, then they still put it in the textbooks. It's like, hello, it's been totally discredited, shown to be a forgery, and still it goes into the textbooks. What?
Let's teach it to our children.
That's right. Let's just give it back to them. So, so then, of course, the question is, you know, there's microevolution in which there's changes inside of a species, but then what there has to be is those interim changes between one species and another. So you've heard of the missing link, right?